My beloved child, something shifted in a conversation you were never meant to hear, and the strange part is that it was not a dramatic confession or a carefully prepared speech that changed the atmosphere. It was only a few quiet words from your soulmate, spoken with a certainty that surprised even them. The third party had expected hesitation. They had grown comfortable believing there was still confusion, still distance, still enough uncertainty to keep everything exactly where it had been. But your soulmate said something different. Something simple. Something that could no longer be misunderstood. And for a moment, the person listening did not know how to respond. Stay with this, because what happened immediately afterward reveals more than the words themselves. Your soulmate did not argue. They did not defend every detail of the past. They did not try to convince anyone that their feelings were valid. Instead, they became strangely calm. That calmness was what changed everything. Because there comes a point when a person stops explaining what their heart already knows, and when that moment arrives, everyone around them can feel the difference. The third party felt it too. They had been waiting for your soulmate to question themselves again, perhaps to say that the connection with you was complicated, uncertain, or something they should leave behind. But those words never came. Instead, your soulmate finally admitted something they had been avoiding for longer than anyone realized: I can't keep pretending this connection means nothing to me. And suddenly, the room felt different. Don't skip, because the important part was not the sentence itself. It was what your soulmate said next. There was a pause, the kind of pause that appears when someone knows there is no returning to the version of themselves that existed only a few moments earlier. Your soulmate looked at the situation differently now. They had spent so much time listening to opinions, expectations, interpretations, and advice that somewhere along the way they had almost stopped listening to the quiet truth inside themselves. But your absence had taught them something presence never could. They began recognizing the difference between missing attention and missing a person. They began understanding the difference between comfort and connection. And slowly, quietly, they realized that whenever everything else became silent, thoughts of you remained. That realization was difficult for the third party to hear, not because anyone was being cruel, but because it meant the emotional landscape had changed. The third party had believed time would weaken what existed between you and your soulmate. Instead, time had clarified it. Your soulmate continued, and their next words carried even more weight: I tried to move forward without understanding what I felt. But every time I did, I found myself comparing everything to what I had with them. There it was. No accusation. No dramatic declaration. Just an honest recognition that some connections leave a deeper impression than people expect. The third party went quiet. They were hearing something they had not prepared themselves to hear. They had believed your soulmate was slowly forgetting you. They had interpreted silence as detachment. They had mistaken distance for closure. But your soulmate was revealing that silence had actually become a place of reflection. And inside that reflection, certain memories of you had become clearer instead of fading. Something important is waiting for you here, because this is where the conversation took an unexpected turn. The third party asked a question. A simple question. So what are you going to do? Your soulmate could have avoided answering. They could have changed the subject. They could have said they needed more time. But they didn't. Their answer came almost immediately. I need to stop letting other people decide what I'm allowed to feel. Those words landed differently. The third party had heard your soulmate talk about you before, but never with this kind of grounded certainty. Something had changed inside them. It was not impulsiveness. It was not rebellion. It was clarity. And clarity can feel unsettling to someone who has grown comfortable with your confusion. The third party began asking more questions, trying to understand when this change happened. Was there a message? A memory? A conversation? Had you contacted them? Had someone told them something new? Your soulmate shook their head. Nothing dramatic had happened. That was the surprising part. The change had happened quietly. One evening, your soulmate had been sitting alone, thinking about the people who had entered and left their life, and for the first time they stopped asking, "Who makes sense for me?" and asked instead, "With whom did I feel most like myself?" Your name entered their mind almost immediately. They remembered conversations where they did not have to perform. Moments when silence between you felt comfortable instead of awkward. Little details you probably assumed they had forgotten. The way you listened when they were struggling to find the right words. The way you noticed changes in their mood before they explained anything. The way certain ordinary moments somehow felt meaningful simply because you were there. These memories did not make them idealize the past. In fact, your soulmate also remembered the misunderstandings, the distance, and everything neither of you knew how to say at the time. But something about looking back with calmer eyes changed their understanding. They started seeing that the imperfections did not erase the connection. They simply proved that both of you were human, learning yourselves while trying to understand each other. And then the third party did something unexpected. They stopped asking questions. That silence lasted longer than your soulmate expected. Because now the third party was thinking. They were realizing that persuading your soulmate to forget you might no longer work. The old arguments had lost their power. Telling them to move on would only make your soulmate more certain that they needed to make their own decision. Trying to criticize the connection would make the conversation obvious. So their approach began changing. This is where the title of this message begins to make sense. The third party had lost control not in some dangerous or dramatic way, but internally. The story they had believed was slipping away. They could no longer predict your soulmate's choices. They could no longer assume your soulmate would follow the same emotional pattern. And when people realize they cannot control an outcome, they often begin planning a new way to influence it. That is exactly what started happening. The third party became unusually calm. Almost too calm. They changed the subject. They smiled. They acted as if your soulmate's confession had not affected them at all. But later, when the conversation ended, they began thinking about what they could do next. Not something harmful. Not something frightening. Something far more subtle. They wanted information. They wanted to understand whether you still cared. Whether you had moved forward. Whether your soulmate had any realistic possibility of rebuilding something with you. Because if they could discover what you were feeling, they believed they might still understand where this story was heading. Stay till the end, because your soulmate had already sensed this change before the third party even made their next move. Your soulmate noticed the sudden curiosity, the carefully casual questions, the strange interest in what you might be doing now. And something inside them became protective, not possessive, not defensive, simply protective of a connection they no longer wanted other people defining. So they stopped giving details. When the third party asked when they had last spoken to you, your soulmate gave a vague answer. When they asked whether your soulmate planned to reach out, your soulmate smiled slightly and said, "Some things don't need an audience." That sentence changed the atmosphere again. Because now the third party understood something they had not considered. Your soulmate was no longer sharing every thought. There was a private decision beginning to form. And the more quietly it formed, the more significant it became. Your soulmate had started thinking about what they would say if they had one completely honest conversation with you. No pride. No old misunderstandings. No outside voices. Just two people speaking from where they are now instead of where they were before. They imagined telling you what the distance taught them. They imagined admitting the things they were too uncertain to admit before. They imagined asking how you truly felt, not assuming, not guessing, but listening. And for the first time in a long while, that possibility did not make them feel overwhelmed. It made them feel calm. But the third party had a plan forming too. They believed there was one piece of information that could change your soulmate's confidence completely. Something about you they thought your soulmate did not know. Something they had been holding back because they never expected your soulmate to become serious about you again. And this is where the story becomes much more interesting. Because while the third party was deciding whether to reveal it, your soulmate had already discovered part of the truth on their own. Not all of it. Just enough to realize that someone had been leaving out an important detail. And once your soulmate understood what that missing detail might mean, the conversation you just heard was no longer the biggest turning point. It was only the beginning. There was one detail your soulmate could not stop thinking about, because the moment they noticed it, pieces of the past began rearranging themselves in a completely different order. It was not some dramatic secret arriving out of nowhere. It was smaller than that. Quieter. Almost easy to overlook. But sometimes the smallest inconsistency is the one that makes a person finally question everything they were told. Your soulmate remembered a conversation from weeks ago, a conversation where the third party had mentioned something about you with surprising confidence. At the time, your soulmate accepted it because there seemed to be no reason to doubt it. But now, after hearing themselves finally speak honestly about you, they replayed those words and noticed something strange. The third party had claimed to know how you felt without ever explaining how they could possibly know. That question stayed with your soulmate: how did they know? And once that question appeared, another followed. Then another. Don't skip, because your soulmate was not looking for a reason to blame anyone. They simply wanted the truth. And the truth had suddenly become more important than preserving anyone's version of the story. Your soulmate began remembering all the moments when they were encouraged to interpret your silence in only one way. If you did not reach out, they were told you had stopped caring. If you seemed distant, they were told you had already moved on. If you protected your emotions, they were told you had never felt as deeply as your soulmate believed. For a long time, those interpretations had quietly influenced them. But now your soulmate began asking the question they should have asked much earlier: What if none of those explanations actually came from you? That realization brought a strange calm. Because suddenly, the past did not seem quite as final as it once had. Your soulmate understood that perhaps both of you had been living inside assumptions. Perhaps each of you had been waiting for certainty while believing the other had already chosen distance. And perhaps the third party had not created that distance, but had unknowingly helped it grow by filling silence with their own interpretation. That distinction mattered. Your soulmate did not want anger. They wanted clarity. So instead of confronting anyone immediately, they did something unexpected. They began observing. They listened more carefully. They noticed what questions the third party asked about you, and even more importantly, which questions they avoided. The third party wanted to know whether your soulmate planned to contact you, but they seemed strangely uninterested in whether your soulmate was happy. They wanted to know whether you still had feelings, but they did not ask what your soulmate actually wanted. They kept returning to one subject: timing. "Are you really thinking of doing something now?" they asked. "Why now?" Your soulmate answered calmly, "Because I finally understand that waiting for perfect certainty can become another way of avoiding what matters." That answer created another silence. Something important is waiting for you here, because the third party now understood that this was no temporary emotional moment. Your soulmate had reached a deeper decision. They were not chasing a fantasy. They were not rushing toward a dramatic reunion. They were simply choosing honesty over endless guessing. And that meant the third party's old approach would not work anymore. So the plan changed. Instead of trying to discourage your soulmate directly, the third party decided they needed to know your side of the story. They started considering whether they could quietly learn something about your current life. Not by invading your privacy, not through anything harmful, but through ordinary conversations with people who might know how you were doing. They believed that if they discovered you had completely closed the chapter, they could bring that information back to your soulmate and finally settle the matter. But there was a problem. The more they thought about it, the more they realized they did not actually know your truth. They had opinions. They had assumptions. They had observations. But very little certainty. And that uncomfortable realization was exactly what caused their composure to begin slipping. Because what if they had been wrong? What if the connection they had dismissed was never as one-sided as they believed? What if you had also been protecting yourself instead of moving on? And what if the silence between you and your soulmate had been misunderstood by everyone, including the two people inside it? Your soulmate sensed this uncertainty immediately. There was a new quality in the third party's voice. Less confidence. More curiosity. And instead of feeling victorious, your soulmate felt something softer. They realized the third party might not be an enemy at all. They might simply be someone who had formed conclusions from incomplete information. That thought changed the emotional direction of everything. Because your soulmate no longer wanted to prove anyone wrong. They only wanted to stop allowing other people's certainty to replace their own experience. Stay till the end, because that shift in perspective led your soulmate to remember one particular moment with you that had never fully made sense. It was an ordinary day. Nothing dramatic happened. You had been talking about something completely unrelated when the conversation suddenly became quiet. Your soulmate remembered looking at you and noticing that you seemed as though you wanted to say something but decided not to. At the time, they assumed it was nothing. Later, after the distance grew, they wondered whether that was the moment you had already decided to let go. But now they remembered your expression differently. It did not look like indifference. It looked like hesitation. Like someone who cared but was uncertain whether caring was still welcome. That memory stayed with them. Your soulmate began wondering how many other moments had been misread simply because neither of you had enough courage or clarity to ask the next question. And for the first time, instead of replaying the past with regret, they replayed it with compassion. Maybe you were both doing the best you could with emotions neither of you knew how to explain. Maybe there was never a villain in the story. Maybe there were simply people making decisions with incomplete information. That realization made your soulmate even more certain about what needed to happen next. Not a grand gesture. Not a dramatic announcement. A conversation. One honest conversation where neither of you tried to predict the other person's answer before asking the question. The third party saw that decision settling into your soulmate's expression, and something inside them shifted again. Their plans suddenly became more urgent, because they believed they still had one final thing to say before your soulmate reached out to you. "There's something you should know first," they finally said. Your soulmate looked at them carefully. This was the moment the third party had been building toward. The information they had held back. The detail they believed might completely change how your soulmate viewed you. Yet strangely, when the moment arrived, the third party hesitated. And that hesitation told your soulmate more than the words could. "What is it?" your soulmate asked. The third party looked away for a second and then said, "I heard something about them a while ago. I never told you because I thought it would only make things harder." Your soulmate felt their attention sharpen, but they remained calm. "Did you hear it from them?" The third party paused. "No." That one word changed everything. Your soulmate did not react immediately. They simply asked, "Then who did you hear it from?" Another pause. Longer this time. The answer was someone loosely connected to both of you, someone who had heard something from someone else. And suddenly, the supposed certainty surrounding your feelings began to dissolve. It was not your truth. It was a story that had traveled through several people before reaching your soulmate. A story that had gradually become treated as fact. Your soulmate almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because the realization was strangely freeing. So much emotional weight had been placed on something nobody had ever confirmed with you. And the third party saw the change immediately. They realized their big revelation had done the opposite of what they expected. Instead of convincing your soulmate to step away, it made them even more determined to speak directly with you. "I don't want second-hand answers anymore," your soulmate said quietly. "If I want to know how they feel, I need to hear it from them." The third party had no immediate response. Their plan was beginning to unravel before it had even fully started. But something else happened in that silence, something neither of them expected. The third party finally admitted they had been afraid. Not of you. Not even of the relationship. They were afraid your soulmate would be hurt again. They had watched your soulmate struggle through uncertainty before, and somewhere along the way their desire to protect them had turned into trying to predict the outcome for them. When they said this, your soulmate softened. Suddenly, the story had another layer. The third party had not been trying to control everything simply because they wanted power over the situation. Part of them believed they were protecting someone they cared about. But protection without truth can still create distance. And your soulmate understood that now. I know you wanted to help, they said. But I need to find out what's real for myself. The third party nodded slowly. The tension between them began changing into something more honest. Yet their plan was not completely abandoned. In fact, it became something entirely different. Instead of trying to stop your soulmate, they decided they wanted to know whether you had been misunderstood too. They wanted to understand what really happened between you, not to interfere, but because they were beginning to suspect the story they believed might have been incomplete from the beginning. And then something happened that none of them were prepared for. Before the third party could ask anyone anything, a new piece of information surfaced naturally, a detail connected to you, something small but unmistakably revealing. It suggested that you had not forgotten the connection as completely as everyone assumed. Your soulmate heard it only briefly. Just a sentence. But the instant those words reached them, they went completely still. Because suddenly, one memory they had carried for a long time finally made sense. And what that memory revealed was about to change not only how your soulmate saw you, but how the third party understood the entire story. The sentence sounded almost meaningless to everyone else, but to your soulmate it landed like a missing piece finally sliding into place. Someone mentioned, almost casually, that you had once asked how your soulmate was doing long after the two of you had stopped speaking regularly. You had not asked for details. You had not tried to reopen anything. You had simply wanted to know whether they were okay. And somehow, that tiny detail had never reached your soulmate until now. For several seconds, they said nothing. Because suddenly they remembered the moment they had been carrying differently for all this time, the moment when they believed your silence meant you had completely stopped caring. They had built so many conclusions around that belief. They had told themselves you were probably happier without them. They had convinced themselves that reaching out would only disturb a life you had already moved beyond. But now there was evidence, however small, that the story had never been that simple. Don't skip, because your soulmate did not immediately turn this into hope. That would have been easy. Instead, they did something more mature. They questioned everything carefully. Why had you asked about them? Was it kindness? Was it lingering affection? Was it simply curiosity? They did not know. And for once, they were willing to admit that they did not know. That was the change. Before, uncertainty had frightened them into accepting other people's interpretations. Now uncertainty was making them want the truth directly. The third party noticed their expression and asked, "Why does that matter so much to you?" Your soulmate looked down for a moment, thinking before answering. Because I was told they never looked back. The third party became very still. That answer carried more weight than either of them expected. Your soulmate continued softly, "Maybe they didn't. Maybe it meant nothing more than concern. But I'm starting to realize how many things I believed without ever asking them." There was no accusation in their voice. Somehow that made the words even stronger. The third party could feel the entire situation changing. They had entered this believing they needed to prevent your soulmate from making an emotional mistake. Now they were beginning to wonder whether the greater mistake had been allowing assumptions to speak louder than two people who never finished their conversation. Something important is waiting for you here, because instead of becoming defensive, the third party finally revealed another detail. They admitted that there had been more than one moment when someone had mentioned you still seemed affected by what happened. Nothing dramatic. Nothing certain. Just little observations. You had become quiet when your soulmate's name came up. You had changed the subject once when someone asked whether you had completely moved forward. Another time, someone noticed you still remembered a small detail about your soulmate that most people would have forgotten. The third party had dismissed all of it. They assumed nostalgia meant nothing. Perhaps sometimes it doesn't. But stacked beside everything else, those moments created a different picture. Your soulmate listened without interrupting. And surprisingly, the feeling rising inside them was not excitement. It was tenderness. Because they suddenly imagined that maybe you had been wrestling with the same questions in your own private way. Maybe you had also stared at your phone once or twice and decided not to send something. Maybe you had also wondered whether reaching out would be welcome. Maybe both of you had mistaken restraint for rejection. That possibility touched something deeper than hope. It created understanding. Your soulmate whispered, almost to themselves, "What if we were both waiting?" The third party heard it. And for the first time, they had no argument ready. There was only silence. The kind of silence where people begin realizing a story they thought was finished may have been interrupted rather than completed. But the third party still had concerns, and this time they expressed them differently. If you talk to them, they said, what are you expecting to happen? Your soulmate considered the question carefully. This mattered, because their answer revealed exactly how much they had changed. I'm not expecting anything. The third party looked surprised. Your soulmate continued, that's the point. I don't want to reach out because I've already decided how the story should end. I just don't want us to keep living inside assumptions. Those words softened something inside the third party. The plan they had been forming to gather information, to understand your position before your soulmate could act suddenly felt unnecessary. Maybe even unfair. If your soulmate wanted truth, then the cleanest path was not another chain of whispered conversations. It was direct honesty. Yet the third party had one last concern. They knew something about your soulmate that perhaps even your soulmate had not fully admitted. They had watched them become more guarded over time. They had watched them hide behind humor when your name appeared unexpectedly. They had noticed how quickly your soulmate changed the subject whenever someone asked whether there was anyone they still thought about. The third party had interpreted that as progress. Now they understood it differently. Your soulmate had not become indifferent. They had become careful. There is a difference. Stay till the end, because that realization changed the third party's role in the story. Instead of trying to stop your soulmate, they suddenly asked a question nobody expected. What would you actually say to them? Your soulmate laughed softly, almost nervously. I don't know. You've been thinking about this, the third party replied. There has to be something. Your soulmate looked toward the window, and the room grew quiet again. Then they said, I think I'd start by telling them I understand things now that I didn't understand then. The third party waited. Like what? Your soulmate took a slow breath. That silence doesn't always mean someone doesn't care. That sometimes people pull away because they care too much and don't know what to do with it. That being afraid of rejection can make two people act like they've already rejected each other. The third party lowered their eyes. Those words were reaching them too. Your soulmate continued, more quietly now. And I'd tell them I'm sorry for the things I assumed instead of asking. That was the moment the third party's entire plan finally transformed. They had been preparing to do something big, something they believed might redirect your soulmate away from you. But now a very different idea formed. What if instead of interfering, they helped remove one misunderstanding? What if there was one piece of the story they could clarify without speaking for you? The third party remembered a conversation from much earlier, one they had nearly forgotten. Someone close to the situation had once told them that you had stepped back because you believed your soulmate needed space. At the time, the third party had interpreted that as an excuse. But hearing your soulmate now, they wondered whether it had been sincere. There's something else, they said. Your soulmate turned immediately. What? The third party hesitated, because this was the detail they should probably have shared long ago. I once heard that you weren't being ignored. They thought they were respecting your distance. Your soulmate's face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough to show the sentence had reached somewhere deep. Who told you that? They asked. The third party explained. It had come from someone who had actually spoken with you around that period, not through several layers of gossip this time, but from a conversation closer to the truth. Your soulmate leaned back slowly. For months, perhaps longer, they had believed you stepped away because you no longer wanted the connection. And all this time, there was at least a possibility that you stepped away because you thought that was what they wanted. Suddenly, the old memories looked different again. The unanswered message that had seemed cold. The conversation that ended too quickly. The moment neither of you asked the obvious question. Your soulmate realized how easily two people can protect themselves into losing contact with each other. And instead of feeling angry about the wasted time, they felt a strange sadness mixed with relief. Because if misunderstanding helped create the distance, honesty could at least reveal what remained underneath it. The third party watched this realization settle across your soulmate's face and finally understood why their earlier words had caused such an emotional reaction. Your soulmate was no longer simply talking about missing you. They were talking about reclaiming their own understanding of the relationship. That was what had made the third party feel they were losing control. Not control over your soulmate as a person, but control over a narrative they had been helping maintain. And now they could see that holding on to that narrative served no one. So they made a decision. I'm not going to ask around about them, they said. Your soulmate looked surprised. The third party continued, if you want to know, talk to them. Whatever happens after that should come from the two of you. There was something unexpectedly peaceful about hearing those words. For the first time in a long while, your soulmate felt as though the noise around the connection was fading. No predictions. No second-hand opinions. No imagined endings. Just one unanswered question between two people. But that was not the end of the third party's plan. It was the beginning of a completely different one. Because they still wanted to do something big, only now it was not designed to keep you apart. They wanted to correct something they had contributed to. There was one conversation from the past where they had repeated an assumption about you as though it were certain. That assumption had reached your soulmate at exactly the wrong moment and quietly influenced a decision that changed everything afterward. The third party finally realized how much weight their words may have carried. They could not erase the past, and they did not want to manipulate the future. But they could tell your soulmate exactly what they knew, exactly what they did not know, and where they had filled the gaps with their own interpretation. "I need to tell you something," they said. "And this part is on me." Your soulmate turned toward them fully. What followed was not an explosive confession. It was something far more meaningful: accountability. The third party admitted that when they told your soulmate you had clearly moved on, they had never actually heard those words from you. They had seen you appearing calm. They had heard you were focusing on your own life. They had assumed the rest. Your soulmate closed their eyes for a second. That sentence had mattered. It had been one of the reasons they stopped themselves from reaching out. Not the only reason, but one of them. And now they were learning it had never been confirmed. The third party apologized quietly. Your soulmate did not respond immediately. Then something surprising happened. They did not become angry. They simply said, "I believed it because part of me was scared it was true." That answer shifted everything once again. Because your soulmate understood they could not blame another person for every choice they made. They had accepted the assumption because it matched their own fear. And recognizing that gave them something more powerful than someone to blame. It gave them responsibility for what happened next. "Then maybe it's time I stop being afraid of the answer," they said. The third party nodded. And there, in that quiet moment, the plan became clear. No secret investigation. No attempt to control what happened. No grand performance. Your soulmate would find a simple, respectful way to open the door to conversation. Nothing demanding. Nothing that assumed you felt the same. Just enough honesty to let you know that if there were unfinished words between you, they were finally willing to hear them. But just as your soulmate began thinking about what those first words might be, the third party remembered one final detail, something you had said long ago that they had never understood until this exact moment. It was only one sentence. Yet when they repeated it to your soulmate froze, because those words suggested that you may have been waiting for one specific sign from them all along. The words were so simple that your soulmate almost asked the third party to repeat them, because suddenly the entire distance between you looked less like rejection and more like two people waiting for the same door to open from opposite sides. The third party remembered you once saying, "If they ever truly want to talk to me, they'll know how to find me." At the time, those words had sounded final. Almost detached. But now, hearing them again in the light of everything that had been uncovered, your soulmate noticed something nobody had noticed before. You had not said, "I never want to hear from them again." You had not said the connection meant nothing. You had left a quiet possibility inside the sentence. A door that was not wide open, but perhaps never completely closed either. Your soulmate stared ahead for a few seconds, replaying those words internally. They really said that, they asked. The third party nodded. A long time ago. And then came the question that changed the energy all over again. Why didn't you tell me? There was no anger in your soulmate's voice. That somehow made the question harder to answer. The third party admitted they had interpreted your words differently. They thought you were placing all the responsibility on your soulmate. They thought telling them would only keep hope alive when everyone was trying to help them move forward. But now, after everything that had happened, they understood there had been another possibility. Maybe you were not asking to be chased. Maybe you were simply saying you would not force yourself into a place where you were unsure you were wanted. And that realization touched your soulmate deeply, because they recognized themselves in it. How many times had they done the same thing? How many times had they waited because they were afraid reaching out would make them look foolish? How many times had both of you protected your dignity while quietly hoping the other person would make the first move? Don't skip, because this was the exact moment your soulmate stopped thinking about whether they should contact you and started thinking about how they could do it without repeating the mistakes of the past. They did not want a dramatic message. They did not want paragraphs filled with explanations you had never asked for. They did not want to arrive carrying expectations. They wanted something honest enough to open a conversation, but gentle enough to let you choose whether to step into it. The third party watched them thinking and asked, "Are you going to do it?" Your soulmate did not answer immediately. Instead, they picked up their phone. Not to send anything yet. Just to look. Your name was still there. That surprised the third party more than they expected. Your soulmate had never deleted it. Maybe they had told themselves it meant nothing. Maybe keeping a contact was ordinary. But at that moment it felt symbolic, not because fate had preserved anything, but because your soulmate realized they had never truly wanted to erase you. They opened the old thread. There were ordinary messages there. Small jokes. Short conversations. A moment where you asked whether they had gotten home safely. Another where they reminded you about something you had forgotten. Nothing cinematic. Yet those simple exchanges carried a warmth that complicated every story your soulmate had been telling themselves. Because real connection often hides inside ordinary details. Your soulmate scrolled slowly until they reached one of the last conversations. They stopped. There it was. A message from you that had once seemed almost casual. "I don't want to pressure you. Just take whatever space you need." Your soulmate read it twice. Then a third time. Something important is waiting for you here, because they suddenly remembered what happened just before that message. They had been overwhelmed. They had become quieter without explaining why. You had noticed. And instead of demanding reassurance, you had stepped back. At the time, your soulmate interpreted that space as you losing interest. But reading the message now, they saw something completely different. You had been trying to respect them. The distance that followed may not have begun because either of you wanted to leave. It may have grown because both of you mistook consideration for withdrawal. Your soulmate covered their mouth for a moment, not from shock, but from the strange tenderness of realizing how easily care can be misunderstood when people are afraid to ask what something means. The third party leaned closer. "What did you find?" Your soulmate turned the phone slightly so they could see. The third party read the message and became quiet. This was another piece they had never known existed. And for the first time, they saw your side of the story not through someone else's interpretation, but through your own words. "That doesn't sound like someone who didn't care," they finally said. Your soulmate looked at them. There was something almost bittersweet in the silence that followed. "No," they replied. "It doesn't." That was when the third party's original plan finally disappeared completely. There was no longer anything to stop. No reason to gather information. No reason to convince your soulmate what your intentions had been. Your words were already there. Quietly waiting in an old conversation neither of them had revisited carefully enough. But now another realization surfaced. The third party had lost control when your soulmate first spoke those unexpected words because they believed your soulmate was about to rush blindly back toward you. What they were witnessing now was the opposite. Your soulmate was slowing down. Thinking clearly. Taking responsibility. They were not chasing a memory. They were trying to understand whether the present could hold a healthier conversation than the past ever did. That difference changed how the third party saw everything. "If you message them," they said carefully, "don't try to fix the whole history in one conversation." Your soulmate almost smiled. "I know." "Then what will you say?" This time, the answer came more easily. Your soulmate looked at the empty message box and said, "Maybe just the truth." The third party waited. Your soulmate began typing, then stopped. Deleted it. Typed something else. Deleted that too. They laughed softly at themselves because suddenly every sentence sounded either too serious or too casual. "This is ridiculous," they said. "I've imagined this conversation so many times, and now I can't even write one line." But beneath the nervousness was something different from before. There was no panic. No desperation. Just the vulnerability that comes when a person finally chooses honesty without knowing what honesty will return to them. Stay till the end, because the third party said something next that your soulmate never expected to hear from them. Maybe that's because you're trying to write the perfect message instead of the real one. Your soulmate looked up. The person who had once been trying to steer them away from you was now helping them understand how to approach you with less pressure. The irony was not lost on either of them. "So what's the real one?" your soulmate asked. The third party shrugged gently. "What would you say if you knew nobody else was going to read it?" That question changed everything. Your soulmate looked back at the screen. Their shoulders relaxed. And then they typed slowly, "I've been thinking about how much we left unsaid. I don't know where life has taken you, and I don't want to assume anything. I just wanted to say that I understand some things differently now. If you ever feel comfortable talking, I'd be open to that." They read it silently. No grand declaration. No demand. No promise. Just an open door. Your soulmate almost pressed send. Almost. But then their thumb stopped above the screen. The third party noticed. "What?" they asked. Your soulmate exhaled. "What if they don't answer?" There it was. The fear beneath everything. Not fear of losing you, the distance already existed. Fear of finally knowing whether the possibility they had protected inside themselves still existed in reality. The third party could have reassured them with an easy prediction. Instead, they gave them something better. Then you'll know you were honest. Your soulmate looked at them for a long moment. That answer was unexpectedly freeing. Because perhaps courage was not believing you would receive the response you hoped for. Perhaps courage was choosing truth even while allowing another person complete freedom to answer however they needed. Your soulmate looked down again. And suddenly they understood why this moment mattered so much. For months, decisions had been built around imagined answers. You probably did not care. You probably had moved on. You probably would not want to hear from them. Every probably had become a wall. But no one had actually asked you. Your soulmate rested the phone on the table without sending the message yet. The third party seemed confused. I thought you were ready. I am, your soulmate replied. But I want to make sure I'm doing this because I want clarity, not because I'm trying to recreate the past. That sentence revealed just how far they had come. Because there was a time when your soulmate would have wanted everything restored exactly as it had been. Now they understood that if anything new ever developed between you, it could not survive by simply returning to an old version of the relationship. Both of you had changed. Both of you had learned things separately. A new conversation would need to begin from where you are now. The third party nodded slowly. Then what are you waiting for? Your soulmate smiled faintly. One night. Not because of superstition. Not because of some dramatic sign. They simply wanted to sleep on the decision and see whether it still felt right when the emotion of the evening had softened. That choice surprised the third party. They had expected urgency. Instead, they saw patience. And patience convinced them more than any declaration could have. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Your soulmate woke up calmer, not less certain. That mattered. Emotional impulses often fade after rest. This one did not. If anything, the intention became simpler. They were not reaching toward you to demand an answer about the future. They were reaching toward you because they no longer wanted misunderstanding to be the final chapter. They picked up their phone again. The message was still saved. They reread it. Changed one word. Removed another sentence. Then stopped editing. But just before sending it, a notification appeared. Not from you. From the third party. Your soulmate opened it and saw a short message. Whatever happens, let it be between the two of you this time. Your soulmate stared at those words and smiled. Because the person who had once reacted so strongly to the idea of you was finally stepping out of the middle. That was the something big they had ended up planning, not interference, but withdrawal from a story that was never theirs to control. And in an unexpected way, that changed everything. Your soulmate returned to your message thread. Their thumb moved toward send. But before they touched the screen, something else caught their attention, one tiny detail beneath your name that had not been there the last time they looked. It was ordinary. Easy to explain. Yet it made your soulmate stop instantly, because if they were reading it correctly, there was a chance you had recently looked back at something connected to them too. And suddenly, the question was no longer only whether your soulmate was ready to open the door. It was whether, somewhere on the other side, you might already have your hand resting on the same handle.